pleasure to be with Elizabeth Barrett Connors today. Elizabeth is a physician and a scientist who is deeply concerned with health care of the elderly and how to improve upon it. She is the chairman of the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at the University of California at San Diego. She came here by a wonderful route by being educated at Mount Holyoke as an undergraduate, received her medical training at Cornell, and has carried out fundamental studies in epidemiology, and particularly now with this focus in her community at Rancho Bernardo on the problems that will be besetting America as we look for the future and the aging of America. Elizabeth, it's a delight to have you. Tell us about your Rancho Bernardo project and about osteoporosis and nutrition of the elderly and all those good things.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm delighted to talk about Rancho Bernardo. It's one of my favorite subjects.
My favorite place.
Yes, well, it's a wonderful group of people. We started out with about 6,000 people 22 years ago. We followed 100% of them. They've been incredibly cooperative about responding to mailers, even the ones that can't come back to the clinic for periodic evaluations. And they've just been a terrific source of information about a whole variety of things with a particular focus on lifestyle and diet.
What are some of the fundamental issues that you have discovered in examining these people?
Well, with regard to exercise, it's not a surprise. Exercise is good for you, and the people who exercise live longer, and we can show a benefit after 75 in the very elderly still of exercise, which is not, as people have said before, that only healthy people exercise. Because we have this prospective study, we can show that it's actually protective. We found that smoking is bad for you. That's not a surprise either, but that if you stop, even in old age, you begin to get a benefit. And I remember one man in his 80s who stopped, and he said to us when he was 82 that if he'd known he'd have felt so much better, he'd have stopped long ago. I'm not quite sure what the moral of that story is, but so I think that the main thing that we've learned about the conventional behaviors like smoking, exercise, and moderate alcohol intake are not surprises, except that we've been surprised, or I've been a little surprised, that the benefit extends right into the very older years. In terms of diet, we found some new things that other people hadn't found before. One of the more interesting ones is the fact that dietary potassium appears to prevent stroke. And since the major source of potassium in the diet is fruits and vegetables, it sort of fits with what the government is now telling us somewhat belatedly, and your mother probably told you long ago, that you should eat more fruits and vegetables.
Well, I have a little bit of a problem with that because man does not live and woman does not live by fruits and vegetables alone. They're certainly a wonderful part of a diet and certainly a good source of potassium, but they're certainly not a very good source of calcium or protein or iron or other trace elements.
Well, I'm not proposing that people live by fruits and vegetables alone, but there's an amazing amount of the U.S. population that doesn't eat any fresh fruits and vegetables. They are in the meat and potato generation, and they really get absolutely no fresh fruits and vegetables, so they really are at a relatively low potassium intake. And of course, the American diet is a diet fairly high in salt. So in order to balance that high sodium intake, you need the potassium.
Absolutely. Now talk a little bit more, though, about when you're talking about fruits and vegetables and potassium and giving up smoking and so on. Those are issues that pertain primarily to things like coronary heart disease and stroke and cancer, some forms of cancer. What are some of the other, maybe late onset diabetes in the sense that obesity causes that to some extent. Talk a little bit about that kind of curse of old age that used to be thought of only as a woman's disorder, but now turns out to be an older man's problem as well, and that's the issue of osteoporosis.
Well, osteoporosis is quite simply a loss of bone, mainly calcium from the bone, and it affects women more than men or earlier than men for two reasons. Women have less bone to begin with, so when they start to lose it, they can get down to a fracturable level earlier. But also at the time of the menopause, a lot of women are then, without estrogen, not able to absorb their calcium as efficiently as before. So they either need to greatly increase their calcium intake or to take estrogen or to do both. I mean, not every woman needs estrogen, but every woman does need to eat at least as much calcium as she is losing. And since we lose some obligatory amount in urine and stool and sweat, you have to take in an amount which is at least equal to that. Otherwise, the body will take the calcium out of the bones to do other essential things.
When you say have enough calcium, what does enough mean to you?
Well, enough to me means about 2 times the RDA. The RDA is, I think, 800 milligrams a day.
Yeah.
I think for a woman past the menopause, it should be twice that.
And talk about how much calcium that is. What do you have to eat to get 1,600 milligrams a day?
You have to have a normal diet, which includes at least 1 glass of milk a day and some dark green vegetables and 6 Tums to get there.
Right. So the point you're making is that it's very tough to do it by food alone.
Yes, unless you really like more milk than most people do.
Because roughly 800 milligrams of calcium is equal to a quart of milk, and very few adults are drinking a quart of milk, much less 2 quarts of milk a day. So that the key here is not only that which you take in your food supply, but that which you know that you have to supplement in order to provide that resource for you.
But it is interesting that if you look at the data, even in Rancho Bernardo, and you look at what people report as their calcium intake now, which probably reflects their lifetime calcium intake, because people's diets, if you're a milk drinker, you tend, as an adult, if you're a milk drinker, you tend to continue to be a milk drinker. If you hate milk, you didn't start drinking it when you were 60, probably. And if you look at what our people told us they were eating in terms of milk and other calcium sources, and then you follow them prospectively, we found that the ones in the lowest milk intake had the highest hip fracture rates. So that even in middle and later life, your calcium intake is important. But I do want to stress, and this is not an original statement, that osteoporosis is a pediatric disease which is presenting to the geriatrician. Because what you eat in adolescence, when you are really putting down the bone, that is all the bone you're going to get to lose later on, is so critical.
But there are some new studies, and ours are among them, that say that even in later years, if you maintain adequate calcium, you can maintain your bone density. And the point you're making, and I see very clearly as I talk to my students and look at a university population here, the notion that kids, young women in particular, are going to drink enough milk. I think it's about at age 12 that girls go away from milk and into Diet Pepsis, and there is no calcium in a Diet Pepsi. And that fact, as you point out, is the pediatric disease that hits us later on when we are no longer into the habit of eating cheeses and drinking milks. And even the dark green leafy vegetables are sort of wild because you have to do about 4 to 5 pounds a day to get adequate calcium, not nearly the intensity of the calcium you get before. So I think that's very important that people focus on the notion of really building their bones early, and milk is not just a kid's drink. And if you're allergic to milk, then for goodness sake, go take a Tums or a calcium of some sort and replace that. Talk a little bit more about that whole issue of calcium and its relationship, for example, to vitamin D. There's been a lot of talk lately about vitamin D and vitamin D supplements, and do you see any of that in your study?
We have not done too much with vitamin D because in San Diego, unless you're housebound, it's very difficult to be vitamin D deficient. We have so many days where there's sunshine out of the whole year. But in other places where there's a little less sunshine, they've been able to show that in the wintertime, older people are definitely vitamin D deficient, and a little bit of vitamin D, which comes in milk in this country, but also can be obtained as a pill, that's very helpful because it helps the calcium metabolism and absorption. So I think that's an important thing to think of. One thing that's interesting, which I've just recently learned about, I'm sure you've known it forever, is that when you get older and your skin gets thinner, it's much less efficient at making vitamin D out of the sunshine. So unless you have more exposure, you may have inadequate vitamin D levels, even if you are out in a moderate amount of sun.
Bone is a dynamic tissue. It isn't just something you hang up in a closet in a biology lab. Talk about that.
Well, I think people don't know that. I mean, I think people think that there's that nice solid structure. You see the skeleton hanging up in the medical school laboratory cartoon, and you think that that's forever bone. But in fact, our bones are remodeling all the time, and that's one of the reasons why exercise is so important, because every time you walk, you have these mini microscopic fractures, which gives you a chance to build a bone. And when we send people into space and they have not got this weight-bearing activity, which tends to keep the bone solid, they lose bone, and people in space a long time are going to have, as you know, osteoporosis.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the most remarkable aspects of sending human beings into outer space. The Russians who went out there have yet to grow back the bone that they lost many years ago when they were out in space.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and the whole notion too of bone as a dynamic tissue is emphasized by the fact that about a third of the weight of a bone is not mineral. It is protein, and so that it's a constant organic turning over and processing and removing the mineral matrix and putting in new mineral matrix and removing the organic matrix and replacing it, so that nutrition plays a role continually. Again, people think that you make a bone when you're 16 years old and that bone is with you forever. It's gone, what, 7 to 10 years after you've made it?
But if you make a good big matrix, then that slow, gradual turnover,
That's right.
when you start losing more than you're making, which happens after the age of 40, in both men and women, then you've got more stuff to work with. So you can lose down quite a bit. You have more opportunity to lose down to the level at which you're likely to break something just because you step off a curb wrong.
Talk about this issue of the hormone again. I want to return to that because, again, we've always thought of osteoporosis as an old woman's disease, the widow's hump, the fractured hips, and so on. My understanding now, it's what, something like for every 3 women, there's 1 man who is going to suffer from osteoporosis.
I think it depends on how you define osteoporosis. Since everybody loses some bone as they get older, then what is osteoporosis? Is osteoporosis having less bone than you had when you were 20? Or is it being in the top 10% of bad bone for your age group? And depending on how you define it, you can make a lot of osteoporosis or a lot less. So that's tricky.
So you would not define it strictly by fracture alone?
Well, fracture is the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, there are a lot of other people with equally severe osteoporosis who don't fall down. I mean, even unless your bones are absolutely transparent, you have to do something to get this fracture.
Men have to be concerned, should be concerned, as they live longer.
I think that they certainly should be on the same calcium kick that the women should be on.
But the issue of the hormone regulation is different. Talk about this issue of the menopause and why that suddenly changes the nature of bone metabolism and puts the woman at greater risk.
Well, I'm not sure I understand all the whys, because just a few years ago we found estrogen receptors on bone, which was quite exciting, but nobody knows exactly how they work yet. But the main thing we know that estrogen does, again, with a mechanism that isn't entirely clear, at least not to me, is that it makes more calcium in your diet be absorbed, and it reduces the amount of calcium that's lost in the kidney. So that means that more of it can go to the bone when it's needed there. And after the menopause, when you don't have estrogen, then your absorption decreases and your loss increases, and so then you are very easily in negative calcium balance.
What do your studies show about hormone replacement therapy? Are you for it or against it? How do we vote on this? How do we behave on this?
Well, that's such a tricky question, Paul. I mean, if you're talking only about osteoporosis, then I think that estrogen is a good thing. But estrogen has other effects. For some women, I believe it causes uterine cancer. For some women, it probably increases the risk of breast cancer. It may protect against heart disease. So here are all these things going on at the same time. And we have to remember that most women don't get these diseases. So it's different. Prevention is a different ballgame than treatment, and I think people tend to forget that. Most women won't get a hip fracture. 9 out of 10 women won't get breast cancer. Most women will not get a heart attack, at least not until they're in their 80s, and you have to get something eventually. So, putting it into perspective then, are we willing to have these risks for these benefits?
I think that is the key, and my understanding of epidemiology of osteoporosis, isn't it something like 1/3 of the women postmenopausally will suffer some fracture before they pass out, and so that we're talking about a very large fraction of
if you live to be 85, you have probably got a 1 in 5 risk of having a hip fracture. There's a lot of fractures in the spine, which is the reason why women tend to shrink, and men also if they're osteoporotic, and women tend to bend over because they get these little fractures on the spine heels like this instead of straight up and down. Those fractures are quite common. They may be the commonest of the fractures, but they're usually not symptomatic. so that, aside from being shorter and perhaps not liking to have a little hump, they don't have any medical significance for most women.
You brought up the notion, well, there's good news and bad news about hormone replacement therapy. Talk about that in terms of a woman dealing with a physician and making a decision. How much of that is influenced by her genetic inheritance, for example?
Well, I think you have to remember that in the United States, the average woman's life expectancy now, if she reaches the age of 50, so she's in a position to make a decision about estrogen, is that she will live to be between 82 and 83 years of age on average. So we have a lot of old women in this country who are doing quite well, thank you very much, without any hormones. So you sort of have to do that as your background noise. Then you say, well, most women then are doing quite well. How can I pick out the women for whom estrogen might be a good thing? Because I don't want to treat a whole lot of women with a medication which is expensive and maybe dangerous for some women if they don't need it. And with the bone scans, I think we've made a major advance because we can pick out people who have pale bones, who have bad bones. We can pick them out early, long before they get to the fracture stage, and we can say, this is a lady who's at high risk to having osteoporosis of a degree that they're going to fracture, who should be treated with calcium and vitamin D, and if that doesn't work, or maybe even if it does, depending on the rest of the woman's history and profile and preferences, we can treat her with estrogen.
With this new high technology that comes in modern medicine, there is this opportunity to, in effect, be aggressive about the way we treat disease. If we could pick up a person early, as you say, and I wish the day would come when the insurance companies would allow those scans to be a part of a medical examination, and I hope someday they will be. Then you focus on those people and really pay a lot of attention and save yourself a lot of money down the road when these people don't have to be hospitalized and confined.
The Rancho Bernardo is what's called an observational study. We give them their results and suggest that they discuss them with their physicians, and if things are abnormal to the point where we're worried about it, we put red stars and we call them on the telephone, but we're not in the business of trying to treat these people. We consider they're our friends, and we're happy to provide whatever screening the government has allowed us to provide with grant money, but we're not interfering with their treatment.
But it's still, the prudency of everything that you've told us today is the notion of take care of yourself when you're young. Build those bones well.
Well, I think there are two messages. One
come.
message, I mean, it's a little bit, I hope I don't offend anyone, like going to confession, but it's very prudent to be very wise when you're younger. That's part of the message, but the other part of the message is if you weren't, you may still be saved if you change and do, and it's still not too late to improve your bones by exercising, by stopping smoking, by improving your diet, and so on. So I think there are two messages. You want to get the most bone you can in your bone-developing youth, but then also remember that it's not all over when you're 21. You're still, as you said, continually remodeling and making bone, so there's still hope and help later on.
In general, as you look at not the patients, as your friends at Rancho Bernardo, are their eating habits changing because you are looking at them?
Well, we actually haven't looked at that. We've obtained the same diet questionnaire over about a 10-year period in 3 different times, and we have done it deliberately that way in order to see whether or not they are changing. We know that they're taking a lot more vitamin and mineral supplements, but we don't know whether or not they've actually changed their diet.
That's good, and I think it's important for people to realize that despite a lot of literature out there to the contrary, that a calcium is a calcium is a calcium, and whether you get it from a milk or a cheese or a dark green leafy vegetable, or from a Tums or from an oyster shell, or, well, don't get it from dolomite because dolomite is contaminated with lead and other heavy metal, that is going to behave inside your body in a fashion which is equivalent.
Your body can't tell whether the vitamin C came from a rose hip or not.
That's right, or synthesized by a dirty old chemist or something like that. I'm interested too in the notion as we think about osteoporosis. I remember several studies, and we actually had a study that showed the same thing, that in general everybody is talking about being overweight and obese is very bad for you, and I would agree with that fundamentally, but when we did a study with our postmenopausal women here in San Diego, we made the remarkable observation that heavy women, overweight women, had much higher bone density because, in point of fact, they were exercising more because
At the same amount of exercise,
that's
dragging
right,
that weight around.
dragging
yes.
that weight around, which is dreadful on the coronary, heart disease situation, actually turns out to have some sort of saving grace in terms of skeletal
Those women
development.
also have higher estrogen levels because you
That's
can make
interesting.
estrogen in your fat cells when your ovaries stop. So the adrenal hormones in overweight women are turned into estrone, a relatively weak estrogen, but an estrogen nevertheless, in fat cells. And if you're a very skinny lady at the time you go through the menopause, you're much more likely to have a lot of symptoms because you don't have any endogenous estrogen. You're not making your own.
So that's the whole notion of don't try to look like the cover of Cosmopolitan
Starved to
magazine.
perfection is not a good deal.
is bad in general. What other sort of issues do you see that we should be thinking about, particularly for the elderly in the years to come? You mentioned a little bit about the notion of coronary heart disease, of potassium concerns. What other concerns do you see?
Well, I think the biggest concern of the elderly is the quality of life. I mean, by the time you get to be 75 or 80, they don't much care which disease they die of, but they don't want to be dependent, they don't want to be in pain, and they don't want a long, lingering exodus where, they're not in control of their lives. So that, I think, is the concern, for example, about dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which everyone is dreadfully frightened of. And the risk of that's really quite high. If you make it to 85, the risk of that, I won't pull any 1 in 5s out of my ear, but it's very common. So that one of the problems with trying to extend our life by all these wonderful things is to worry about, well, are we living longer or dying longer? And I think that's a real question that individuals in society are going to have to address.
Yeah, the issue, expressed in another way perhaps, is it's not how long you live, it's how good is the quality of that life. And I think that, too, a lot of people, as they grow older, don't get the same pleasures out of food that I believe that they should, that they tend to be frightened by what they read in a morning newspaper. This is a good food, this is a bad food, do this, do that. And
I'm not sure they taste it the same either. I mean, I think as people get older, they lose their smell and their taste to some degree, so that, I can be not hungry at all, and if I walk into a restaurant or my husband is cooking at home something that smells wonderful, the juices flow and I'm ready to eat.
Sure.
And apparently older people lose the ability to respond to food that way.
So throughout all of the ages and stages of life, we should treat food not as some sort of a prophylactic or some sort of a medicine. We should consider it part of the manifestation of self in our best health, and also the best pleasures that we can have from a healthy diet that brings us a full and healthful
Well, let me
life.
disagree with you or maybe just put a slightly different light on that. I also agree you shouldn't eat stuff which is awful to stay alive, because, then why bother?
Why
so,
bother?
if I'm going to have to live on 3 fiber bars a day, I don't want that. But on the other hand, it is possible to cook very good food, which is not the old 20-year-ago traditional American diet, which was a very high-fat diet in which we all had gravy and butter and sour cream and a fatty piece of meat, which was big enough to feed a family of 5, on our plate. I've eaten a lot of dinners like that in my youth, and I now have developed a taste for other food, which I think is much better than that food, and which happens at the same time not to be so loaded with saturated fats. So I don't want to convey the idea to the public that good food that tastes good is bad for you.
That's right.
There is a point at which you can get to the place where food that is really good for you, maybe, tastes good. But there's intermediate kind of food which is wonderful. It requires more creative cooking, perhaps, than many Americans were raised on. You have to learn to like, God forbid, red and green peppers and squash.
Elizabeth, the bottom line with respect to food and health and the older ages that we face, what is the strategy one should use?
Well, I think the old thing your mother told you about a balanced diet is still true. You need to eat some of everything. I think everyone could increase at least 1 serving of fruit and vegetables above what they currently eat. It wouldn't hurt, and it might help. They do need calcium and vitamin D, and people will have to think about what their own diet is like and see whether or not they need supplements or not. I guess the other thing I'd recommend is that you eat several small meals a day instead of eating this one great big meal at dinner, which is unfortunately the American plan. There's a lot of studies that suggest that it's much healthier to have breakfast, a snack, lunch, a snack, and dinner. And that, I think, is more easy for elderly people sometimes to digest as well. So.
And that focus on weight management, always that focus on
Well,
weight
elderly
management.
people don't seem to be fat. It's a
Is that
rare
right?
obese old person. They either lose weight or the fat ones have died. I rarely see someone who is elderly, who I define as someone who's 10 years older than I am, and that's a moving target. But I think you rarely see an elderly person who is really overweight. I mean, they may not be skinny, but I don't think they need to be skinny. As you pointed out, they have better bones. If they fall down, they're less likely to fracture. That's a fact. I mean, it's cute,
That's
but
right,
it's a
they've
fact.
got nice bumpers,
And
too.
you know, there's not much evidence that overweight is bad for your heart in old people. There's an unexplained reduced risk of stroke in overweight people. I'm not talking about great, huge, obese people. I'm talking about people who are heavier than the fashion magazine.
Really, the bottom line is to enjoy good food, to enjoy good health, to enjoy life. And the issue isn't to live forever. The issue is to live that life which gives you a great deal of pleasure and enjoyment, that allows me to have friends like you and be able to talk about the science that we do and try to help other people understand their bodies in a fashion which, in point of fact, gives them that same freedom that you and I enjoy with our knowledge. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for being with me today. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. It was fun.